Good afternoon. So just some notes on how the seminar will run today. We'll hold questions until the end of the presentation. If you are on Zoom, enter your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom and we'll address them. If you're in the room, raise your hand. So we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. CSDE acknowledges we are located on Coast Salish territory, the traditional territory of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, and other traditional Native peoples. This land acknowledgement is but one small gesture in the ongoing process of working toward repairing and sustaining relations with the Coast Salish lands, waters, peoples, and their other than human kin. CSD's commission logo from Native artist UW Professor Marvin Oliver acknowledges these vital connections to Native peoples and territories. In terms of funding, CSDE is extremely grateful for support from the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development, the College of Arts and Sciences, Evans School, School of Public Health, School of Social Work, the Business School, and the Population Health Initiative, the eScience Institute, and the Associate Provost for Research. So today, we're really excited to host Dr. Tyson Brown. Thank you for being with us today, Tyson. Dr. Brown is an associate professor of sociology at Duke University. His current research focuses on developing novel approaches to measuring structural racism across societal domains and quantifying structural racism's health effects, with the goal of providing knowledge to achieve health equity and improve population health. The title of his talk today is Racism and Health Stratification, a New Theory-Driven Empirical Approach.
All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to share some of my current projects, and the only thing that would have made this better is if it had worked out for me to actually be there in person. But hopefully, I'll get to see some of you all at conferences upcoming later this year. And so today, I'll be discussing a project that aims to contribute to our understanding by conceptualizing and quantifying structural racism, as well as its impact on population health. And I'll be discussing what I see as some important directions for the field. So I'd like to just begin by zooming out to give an overview of trends in research on race and health, with special attention to where we've been, where we are, and where I think we should go. And obviously, we've gained a lot of important, really foundational information about racial inequities in health from descriptive studies. And I think that they continue to have their place and provide really valuable information. Unfortunately, the field has moved largely beyond discredited biological and cultural deficit explanations. We've also seen the limited utility of behavioral human capital explanations for racial inequalities, right? So oftentimes residual racial inequities, after accounting for health behaviors and socioeconomic resources, they're oftentimes attributed to discrimination. And yet these approaches, however, operate under the untenable assumption that racism does not shape these behaviors and the acquisition of socioeconomic resources in the first place, right? So it's becoming increasingly clear that focusing solely on individual level behavioral and economic factors leads to an incomplete and likely biased understanding of the drivers of racial inequities in health. So, and yet relatively few studies have actually empirically tested this proposition. And so skeptics point to the dearth of quantitative research on the relationship between structural racism and health, and they dismiss structural racism as a slippery concept for which we lack robust empirical evidence documenting its effects. So as a field, we really have an opportunity to gain empirical traction by actually measuring structural racism and its effects on health. And this will enable us to do a number of things, including answering new, salient, and innovative questions, employing more rigorous research designs to add a little bit greater certainty and credence to a lot of these findings, and also to build a knowledge base to inform efficacious racial equity solutions, which I think ultimately is something that many of us care about. And despite the centrality of structural explanations for understanding racialized inequality, less than 1% of studies on the link between race and health have actually focused on structural racism, which I think is, somewhat problematic. And rarer still are studies examining how structural racism affects the lives of older adults. And so investigating health inequities in later life presents a number of challenges, which many of you know, but it also provides a unique opportunity for understanding the cumulative impact of social inequities across the life course. So racial inequities in later life are rooted in more than a half-century differential exposure to various forms of racism. So I think this is a really an important area for the field to move. So my colleague, Patricia Holman, and I, we have a recent study in health affairs that examines the relationship between state-level excess Black disenfranchisement and health among Blacks and whites. And we link this, and we use the health and retirement study. And the results show that living in states with higher levels of racialized disenfranchisement is associated with more depressive symptoms, more functional limitations, more difficulty performing IADLs, and more difficulty performing ADLs among Black people. However, there was no statistically significant relationship between racialized disenfranchisement and health among white people. So these findings collectively suggest that policies aiming to mitigate disproportionate Black felony disenfranchisement are not only essential for political inclusion, but also may be valuable tools for improving population health equity. So to better understand the role of structural racism in shaping health, I'd like to outline several research priorities to move the field forward. And the first is that we should utilize core tenets of structural theories to guide our measurement approaches. And then secondly, we need to develop novel theory-driven multi-sectoral measures of structural racism that align with how we are, contemporary scholarship conceptualizes structural racism. And then third, by mapping structural racism, we'll gain a better understanding of the geographic variation in racial exclusion and subordination, and be able to identify certain hotspots. I always find maps really useful, and I think that they generate new questions and just have a lot of utility. And then fourth, we should estimate the impact of structural racism on racialized health patterns by linking contextual structural racism measures with geocoded data on health and demographics. I'm going to show a couple examples of that today with the HRS and the BRFSS. And then fifth, we need to lower the barriers to this type of research by building national publicly available data, a national publicly available data infrastructure of measures of structural racism to catalyze research on the structural determinants of health. So my talk today will primarily focus on three things, and that is utilizing the core tenets to guide measurement, and then developing novel measures of structural racism, and also estimating the association between structural racism and health. So scholars lament that there are many challenges to measuring structural racism because it's a complex and insidious de facto phenomena that's often hidden or at least not directly observed. And so it's not surprising that there are relatively few empirical studies that explicitly measure it, right? So here's a definition of structural racism. I'm not going to read it, but you can check it out here. It's it's become a classic now. It's 25 years old. It's by my colleague, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, where he lays out a description of structural racism. And you can see it's rather broad and encompasses many different facets of society. All right, moving on. My colleague, Patricia Holman, and I, we have a study that's under review that scopes the broader literature to identify central tenets of structural racism theories to understand the complexity of structural racism, right? And so we build upon prior theoretical innovations by distilling foundational ideas of structural racism in the literature to generate a definition that we believe provides conceptual and analytical clarity on its nature and its impact. And so we posit that structural racism involves several things. And so the key tenets are that it's a multifaceted, interconnected, and institutionalized system of relational subordination for people of color and superordination for whites that is observable as manifest racial inequities in life chances. And so in short, structural racism refers to systemic racial exclusion from power, resources, opportunities, and well-being, and it's embedded in major political, economic, medical, criminal, legal, and social institutions. And it's observable as racial inequities in things across the board, like education, occupation, wages, wealth, health, political representation, incarceration, and housing. And so structural racism is often considered a fundamental cause that's driving racial inequities in health, because it shapes a whole constellation of more immediate health risks and also health promoting resources that individuals are exposed to. So structural racism can affect health through many, many different intervening mechanisms, which we'll be discussing today. So empirical studies on structural racism are often out of step with theoretical insights, and they have tended to be limited in a number of respects. So for example, studies have typically relied on a single indicator of structural racism, which is useful, but often is subject to measurement error. Or they've examined several indicators, but looked at them separately, which, and often overlooking relationships among structural forms of racism and how they operate as a system and jointly shape health, as theory would suggest. So not only do these approaches fail to capture the extent to which indicators of structural racism are interconnected and reflect an underlying latent construct, but they also lead to an incomplete understanding and biased estimates of the impact of structural racism on racial inequities in health. And then furthermore, much of the structural racism measurement has been at the meso level, such as neighborhoods and counties, largely overlooking macro level contexts such as the state. And so just to be clear, I think that counties, neighborhoods are really key and important. They've been most commonly studied. And so I viewed this study as sort of complementary in saying, let's think about the role of states. And very few studies have examined the health impact of structural racism at the state level, which is unfortunate because US states are obviously important legal, administrative, and political units. Also, states have always provided an important context for racial stratification, including the most obvious roles that they played in slavery, lynchings, Jim Crow, anti-miscegenation laws. We could go on. And yet states continue to have a great deal of autonomy and are heterogeneous in terms of their racializing policies and practices, such as disenfranchisement laws, aggressive policing, punitive sentencing, expansion and contraction of the social safety net, right? We go on and on. And so I think it's really important to think about states as racializing institutional actors. And so as a result, we're working on a project that proposes conceptualizing states as these racializing institutional actors that shape population health. So after immersing myself in the literature over the last couple of years, I was really surprised to find these huge gaps in the literature on structural racism. And there are a lot of questions remaining as to how to best measure structural racism as well as its impact on health. And so I'm currently working on a project that aims to address a couple of these questions, two of which I'm going to focus on today. And the first is, does state level structural racism across societal domains reflect an underlying latent construct? Latent constructs are phenomena that are not directly observable, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then secondly, is structural racism associated with worse health outcomes among Black and white people? So to examine variability in US state level structural racism and its relationship to with health among Blacks and whites, we combine indicators of structural racism from several sources of publicly available data, and then we link these to geocoded individual health and demographic data from the Health and Retirement Study and also the BRFSS. So the HRS, many of you are familiar with, is sort of the gold standard longitudinal study for older adults. It's nationally representative, it's been fielded for the last 30 years or so. Really excellent source of data. And then the BRFSS is, of course, the largest US health survey. And so that's got, really huge numbers of individuals represented at the state level. So there's a lot of utility there. The analytics sample that I'm going to be focusing on today is comprised of US born Blacks and whites. And the 15 states are excluded from the analyses today because data on Black people is not available due to their very, very small population sizes in these states. And I should mention that the 35 states included in the study, they do account for 99% of the Black population and 93% of the white population. So we're really capturing, the vast majority of groups here. The states that are excluded, which is unfortunate, they tend to be more sparse, fewer people, and certainly fewer racial and ethnic minorities, and Black people in particular. So this table shows each of the domains and the indicators of structural racism that I examined. And again, we use publicly available data to examine structural racism, and spanning 5 different domains, including the judicial system, education, economic resources, political participation, and segregation. And this measurement approach is informed by theoretical perspectives, as well as previously validated measures of state level structural racism. So the next step is to test whether state-level structural racism reflects an underlying latent construct, right? And so we're especially interested in measuring structural racism in ways that are in line with structural theories, as I mentioned before. And a latent variable approach is well suited for minimizing measurement error and also capturing conceptual properties of a complex system that's difficult to quantify or directly measure, such as structural racism. In many ways, I think that this concept, this construct and this method are really well suited for one another. Yeah, I think it's a really nice match for a number of reasons. We can talk about that during Q&A. But along those lines, the 9 indicators of structural racism that I mentioned before were used to develop a latent measure of structural racism. And specifically, we use confirmatory factor analysis to measure the extent to which structural racism across domains reflect an underlying construct of structural racism. And we systematically evaluated model fit using varying model specifications related to correlated errors and also dimensionality. And so all considered, the CFA measurement model that specifies a single dimension for structural racism and allows for other common sources of variance in the indicators that are largely conceptually motivated, has a good fit with the data and generates reasonable parameter estimates. You can see that here. And, just building on the previous slide, this figure illustrates the factor structure of the latent construct of structural racism. And so these correlated errors are all intended to address common sources of variation that are dependent on the effect that are independent of the effect on structural racism of the various indicators. And so taken together, the various statistics show that these indicators reflect an underlying latent construct. You can see the fit statistics are in the, the good to very good range, I'd say. So now I'd like to turn to addressing the second research question, which is how does structural racism shape health among Blacks and whites? Ecosocial theory has become a leading framework for understanding how macro-level discriminatory environments impact health, right? So thinking in particular about the work of Nancy Krieger and a number of other folks. And the theory suggests that macro-level structural racism has deleterious effects on Blacks' health. More specifically, ecosocial theory points to how structural racism results in inequitable life chances and ultimately harms the health of Black people via an array of what's termed pathways of embodiment. And those include things such as economic injustice, social deprivation, toxic living conditions, political exclusion, inadequate healthcare, and also psychosocial factors, including things like social stressors, low control, and stigma, and feelings of inferiority. And so as the oppressed group, we would logically expect structural racism exposure to be linked to worse health problems among Black people because of its negative impact on their resources and their status and their exposures. And so that part's pretty straightforward. But discriminatory social environments have the potential to affect everyone. And so by measuring structural racism, we can also examine its effects on whites. And because whites are the dominant group, it's less clear how structural racism will impact their health. And there are actually a few competing hypotheses. And so first you have the traditional conflict perspective that sees oppressive social relations as a zero-sum game, benefiting the dominant group at the expense of the subordinate group. And so in this scenario, whites would benefit from structural racism because it provides them with greater relative status, power, advantages, and also economic resources. And so if that's the case, we would expect to see a negative relationship between health problems and racism among white people. Now, on the other hand, there's a great deal of research that in theory suggesting that social inequality is in fact bad for everyone. And so universal harm hypothesis would predict that structural racism is also detrimental to the health of whites. And this is in line with structural pluralist theories positing that structural inequalities damage social relations and make society as a whole less productive, less cooperative, less safe, and less healthy, thereby harming both marginalized and also dominant groups. And still, we might expect whites to reap some benefit from their structural advantages. And so the harmful effects might be weaker for whites than for Blacks. And so that's why these lines that are shown are not parallel. And of course, it's also possible that whites' health is unaffected by structural racism, or that at least it appears to be unaffected by racism, because racism benefits whites' health in some ways while harming their health in other ways, such that the net effect is zero. And while there's a growing literature theorizing about the links between structural racism and population health, as I mentioned, empirical research on the topic has been really rare. So that's where this study comes in. We use 5 common measures of population health, including self-rated health, functional limitations, BMI, depressive symptoms, and also the number of poor mental health days over the last month. And all of these have been shown to be reliable and valid measures of health among Black and white populations in the US. In order to isolate the effects of structural racism on health, the models adjust for a handful of conditions, including age, gender, region, as well as state level unemployment rates, state level income inequality as measured by Gini, and also the proportion of the state that is Black. We also use multivariate regression analyses to estimate the relationship between structural racism and health outcomes. And consistent with theory, all models are stratified by race to allow for race-specific estimates, and all models include robust standard errors clustered by state in order to adjust for heteroscedasticity and also non-independence. Results were also similar using multi-level models. So I'd like to jump into the results showing the relationship between structural racism and health. So here we see that higher levels of structural racism are associated with worse self-rated health among Black people in the health and retirement study, right? So it's significant at the 0.05 level. You see that as structural racism increases on the x-axis, the number or the value for self-rated health also increases, reflecting worse health, right? And to provide a little bit of context for the strength of this association, a 1 standard deviation increase in structural racism has an impact on self-rated health that's equivalent to 2 standard deviations of age, which I think is important to note because, we're looking at a sample of adults that are aged 51 to 80. And so we often, during that stage of life, we often think of age as a very powerful determinant or predictor, at least, of health. And the fact that structural racism is perhaps twice as strong an indicator of health in that sample, I think really speaks volumes and points to the significance of this as a social determinant of health. And so, rather robust relationship between structural racism and health among Black people. However, there is no statistically significant relationship between structural racism and whites when we're looking at self-rated health, as reflected by the non-significant effect here. So moving on to results for functional limitations, we see that structural racism is associated with more functional limitations among Black people and statistically significant, but not among whites. So very similar. And then moving to BMI, we see the same pattern for body mass index, where structural racism is associated with higher BMI for Blacks, while it's unrelated to whites' BMI. Structural racism is also associated with more depressive symptoms for Black Americans, but not whites. Again, you see this familiar pattern where it's statistically significant for Black people, but not white people. And then looking at these results together, the pattern is remarkably consistent across all 4 health outcomes, right? And so this was really, we felt like when we saw these results, we felt like, okay, we may be onto something here. We're picking up a signal. We have confidence because we're not cherry picking. We're looking at some of the common most measures of population health in large surveys, and we're getting very, very similar results. And so we felt a measure of confidence that we're heading in the right direction, we're onto something. And yet we wanted to continue replicating this, not just among different outcomes in the same data set, but we thought, well, let's go to another data set. And what better data set than picking the largest nationally representative data set on health? And so that's what we did when we decided to look at the BRFIS. And so here we examine the relationship between structural racism and health using the BRFIS. And as you can see, once again, we find that structural racism is harmful for the health of Blacks. And this is true for both self-rated health and also the number of poor mental health days. That's not the case for whites, however. And in fact, results show that higher levels of structural racism are predictive of better mental health for white people. And this is in line with the zero-sum or conflict perspective. And so just to recap, 6 out of 6 times structural racism was harmful for Blacks, 5 out of 6, it was unrelated to whites' health. And then in one case, whites appear to actually benefit from higher levels of structural racism. Of course, we can't have a talk about racism and health without talking about, this crazy pandemic that we're in. And there's been a lot written about this, number of commentaries. I think a number of folks there have written commentaries. I've written commentaries about this. And yet our evidence base is still somewhat thin. I think that, there's reason to believe that structural racism is a driving force for these racial disparities in mortality from COVID. And yet we don't have a ton of research that's documenting that. And so I'm working on a project that looks at this, that uses that same scale to look at Black-white inequalities at the state level. And I'd like to show you some preliminary results. Here, you see that high levels of structural racism on the x-axis are predictive of greater Black-white inequalities in COVID mortality at the state level. That's reflected on the y-axis, right? And it's a rather steep gradient. So you see that states with the lowest levels of structural racism, lowest, it's still extremely high, but it's all relative, right? So states with the lowest levels of structural racism, you see that the Blacks have an excess of about 80% higher odds of dying from COVID relative to whites. Whereas states with the highest levels of structural racism, Blacks are more than 4 times as likely as whites to die from COVID. And so it's a rather strong relationship, especially given the power when we're looking at less than 50 states here, but we're able to detect this, and it was in fact statistically significant. And so I felt like this was a really compelling, and I think I'm excited about this line of work going forward. And I'll just, as a kind of an overview, I'd like to just kind of situate this and mention that I view this as an early study in the nascent but growing field. And I'd like to share what I think are a few key take-home points before pivoting to talk about some exciting new directions. And the first is that key tenets of structural racism theory are really useful for informing measurement strategies. They really guided our measurement approach, and we feel good. We're confident in those results based on the latent construct fitting, and then also its links to population health in a couple different data sets. And then secondly, consistent with the notion that racism involves a multifaceted, interconnected, and institutionalized system, we find that indicators of structural racism do in fact reflect an underlying latent construct. Third, and more broadly, findings highlight the utility of ecosocial theories focus on the contingent health consequences of macro-level discriminatory environments, right? So we saw that structural racism was harmful for the health of Black people, but not whites. And then fourth, the study also contributes to the literature by demonstrating the importance of studying states to understand health inequities. And so we conceptualize states as racializing institutional actors that shape population health. I think this is a really important direction for future research. I know that folks right there at UW are working on this. I'm thinking in particular about the work of Jake Grumbach. It's really influential in my work. And I'm excited about this line of research because it provides evidence that dismantling structural racism is necessary to improve population health and achieve health equity. So in an article that just came out last week, my co-author and I suggest a number of what I think are exciting opportunities for future research to enhance our understanding of the links between racism and health. For example, future studies should use longitudinal data to understand temporal dimensions of this relationship, such as the potential impacts of things like sensitive periods, right? We don't know whether structural racism is particularly deleterious, in early life, midlife, or later life. We can also think about the roles of duration of exposure, and also potential lagged effects, right? So when you move into a discriminatory environment, or an environment that's more discriminatory than where you left, how long does it take for that impact to really get under the skin and lead to health inequities? And I think that this is a direction, this is a direction that my work is going in. I just recently collected data on structural racism spanning 20 years. And so I'm excited to analyze that and move in that direction. And I'm also interested in examining the intersection of multiple levels of racism, including macro, meso, and also micro levels, right? So today I focus at the macro level, the state level, but certainly the meso and micro levels are certainly very, very important. As I mentioned, this was sort of to complement and somewhat correct the overemphasis, as I see it, on more granular levels. And finally, we need a better understanding of the health consequences of multiple forms of racism, including historical, cultural, and legal forms. So residing in southern states versus non-southern states is associated with worse health, and that relationship tends to be particularly strong for Black people. And the American South is distinct in a number of ways that may be pathogenic, particularly for Black people. And so there's an array of historical and contemporary contextual factors that likely contribute to their poor health. For example, research suggests that Southern Blacks' health may be harmed by place-based legacies of things like historical racial violence, such as slavery and lynchings and Jim Crow, And yet the empirical evidence is still relatively thin. And so this is a topic that I'm working on, with attention to the direct and indirect links to modern health via contemporary racial climates as well. And there's a lot of room for innovation in the space, in particular using digital trace data. We think about the digital revolution and harnessing, new data sources to identify what were previously hidden aspects of racism. And it's likely that the health of Blacks is undermined by unobserved forms of contemporary cultural racism. And so I'm working on examining spatial variation in cultural racism manifest in racial bias and hate groups and hate speech, among others. Preliminary findings show that these forms of racism are ubiquitous, but particularly high in the South, and that these factors contribute to Blacks' worse health in the South. And so we plan to explore this further, as well as examine linkages among historical racism and contemporary cultural and structural racism. And here is really an example of a space where using new forms of big data, digital trace data, can be particularly useful. And legal and policy aspects of structural racism are also really, really important, right? And so they direct our attention to what Bambra and colleagues refer to as the causes of links between place and health, right? And so I want to briefly highlight a couple really wonderful resources on structural drivers of health. There's an article came out in 2021 by Medina Agenor and colleagues that provides a database of structural racism related laws for health equity research. Anyone interested in sort of jumping in this space, I would encourage you to check that out. Also, recent articles by Galeen Samari and colleagues, as well as Morgan Philbin and colleagues, illustrate the utility of measuring immigration-related policy climates and include data on hundreds of policies over time. It's a great resource. And in addition, a very recent article, hot off the press, by Kemp, Grumbach, and Montez provide robust evidence of the health consequences of state policies across 15 domains spanning more than 20 years. This is really impressive work, and I think this is a really important direction for future research to move in. And then finally, in a recently published study in JHSV, my co-authors and I introduced structural intersectionality as an approach to population health. And so we demonstrate an application of structural intersectionality using administrative data to examine the relationship between macro-level structural racism, structural sexism, and economic inequality across US states. And we link these state-level measures to individual health and demographic data from the BRFIS to investigate how dimensions of structural oppression overlap and affect population health. And our analyses show that these structural inequalities do in fact vary considerably across US states and intersect in a variety of ways, but do not strongly or positively co-vary across states. And so in the study, we also find that these structural inequalities individually and jointly shape health, and that they're most consistently associated with poor health of Black women, right? And taken together, our findings point to the utility of structural intersectionality as an important direction for future research on health disparities, especially given this finding that they tend to be particularly associated with worse health among Black women, which is consistent with what intersectionality theories might predict. So this line of research on health consequences of multi-sectoral structural racism, I think, offer key insights into what can be done to achieve health equity. And so just as specific policies and practices created and exacerbated inequalities, they could be used to mitigate and eliminate them, right? So based on the results, it's clear that economic and social policies are in fact health policies. And also given the systemic and nature of structural racism, whereby racism within different spheres reinforce one another, incremental interventions focused on a single domain are unlikely to really appreciably move the needle, right? And so rather, I argue that bold actions that address racial inequality across societal domains are necessary to improve Black Americans' health and achieve health equity. Thank you. Look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Tyson, for that excellent presentation. So many exciting directions. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? Okay. Yeah, can you enter the chat? The computer turned off.
Yeah, you can just click on that so we can see what they're saying too. Abraham, would you be willing to ask your question in person?
Sure. It's great talk. Thank you so much. And it sparked a ton of questions for me as you were going. I think that the one I put in the chat was about the sort of going below the state level. And, you know, I'm thinking about like metropolitan statistical areas or county levels. Would you expect to find similar sorts of results and associations below the state level? And what differences might you expect to find if you were to do this sort of analysis at a finer geographic resolution? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, right? Because, you know, from theory, we'd imagine that structural racism is in fact a multi-level phenomena, and that ecosocial theory and other theories would predict that at each of these levels, these are likely have health consequences. And so I completely agree that I think that implicit in your question is that the belief that sub-state level aspects of structural racism are likely to impact health. There's some evidence that suggests that that is in fact the case. And so there's been a handful of studies that looked at the county level or the MSA or the PUMA. You know, I'm thinking about work by folks like Bert Chantarat or Work O'Brien, a number of individuals who have been measuring structural racism broadly across sectors where it influences health at a more granular level. I'm thinking about the work of Ali Sewell and a number of others. And so, yes, I do think that that is likely, you know, I think that that's an important aspect of this. As I mentioned before, you know, I viewed this study focusing at the state level as sort of a complement to that research, which has, you know, been the predominant focus in the literature. I do think that the field, it's time to kind of go take the next step and look at these in combination. So conducting multi-level analyses. So simultaneously looking at the relative contribution, looking at the synergies between levels, first of all, how do these intersect? What is the relationship between state level, county level, MSA level, structural racism? And then also, what are the relative roles that they play in shaping population health, right? Is the county or MSA level, is that a stronger determinant? Or is the state level stronger? Do the effects flow from the state to the county or vice versa, right? So I think that these are really important questions. They're empirical questions, and the data is out there now, theory is out there. And so I really hope that the field moves in that direction. I certainly am. I've actually just collected it. And so I'll have answers in a couple months. But I think this is really key for the next step in looking at this work. And I'm influenced by a number of scholars who do great work in this field. I think about the work of Alicia Riley, who really called for the field to go beyond, to look at neighborhoods, but not stop there, right? We need to really expand and think about context and different spatial units and think about their interrelationships and whether or not they play unique roles in shaping population health in general, and in particular, racial inequities in health. So great question. And I think that it's an empirical question. I will not go out and speculate which one is more important. I will say that when I was doing this work about 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic, I got a lot of pushback about state level. I said, wait a minute, there's a lot of heterogeneity in states. What are you doing? Seattle is a lot different than Western Washington, right? I get it. And yet I still find these results. And so it's really fascinating that I'm still able to pick up a signal despite great heterogeneity within these spatial units. And then, you know, finding results in multiple data sets on multiple health outcomes. And so I think there's something there. And I think that the next step will be to look at the interplay between macro and meso levels. Thank you.
Great, so let's move on to the next question by Wat. Did you want to answer live? Okay.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll just read the question. Interesting.
I just got the option to unmute, but sure, I can go ahead and ask my question. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you chose the variables to put into when you were modeling the latent construct of structural racism, and how you plan, I mean, moving forward with future iterations of this work, whether you plan to stick with those variables or would you include more? And similarly with your justification, and then how these variables might change when looking at structural racism at different geographic scales. Do you envision that structural racism is experienced the same way at the state level as it is at maybe a neighborhood level, like a census tract, or maybe at a county level? And yeah, just was curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So, when I was thinking about measurement, I really kind of went back to theory and said, well, where should I be looking? And in theory, pointed to, sort of taking a multi-sectoral approach, right? And so looking at education, the economy, housing, criminal, legal, and political domains, and others. And so I started there. And so in this study, we look at 5 different domains, 9 different indicators. And each of those indicators have been studied in prior research, right? And so they've been validated. There's, roughly almost a dozen articles that have used similar indicators. And where this paper departs from previous literature is combining them in a conceptually and methodologically appropriate way to get at the systemic properties. And so that was sort of the rationale for those specific indicators that I used. Number one, that they're multisectoral, and then number two, that they've been used and validated, so you can have sort of a relationship and engage with the prior literature. And yet they're certainly not exhaustive, I'm just scratching the surface here. We're really, this research is really, in my opinion, in its infancy, and there's so much room to grow. So I hope that, as this field matures, that we'll be bringing in more and more measures. There's a lot of folks that are doing work in this space now. And so I think ultimately that can be a really good thing, very generative, especially when the work is done thoughtfully and when it's linked, when the data and analyses are in fact linked to theory, then I think that can be useful. I believe your second question was, do I think measurement and the most salient aspects of structural racism for health and health inequities may differ at different spatial units, different levels. And, again, ultimately that's an empirical question that we just don't know. But I suspect that, that would be my operating assumption. That would be my hypothesis that, in fact, different aspects may be particularly salient at the county level versus the state level and vice versa. And that it's possible that, the latent measurement approaches would fit differently, right? And so there have been a handful of recent studies that looked at sub-state level analysis, so whether it be PUMA or designated driving areas, that found that there were latent classes of structural racism. And so that's a distinction, right? And so I think we're really at the beginning of this research, and there's so many unanswered questions. But that's what kind of makes it exciting, because if this is kind of the wild, wild west, unfortunately, but hopefully, in 5 or 10 years, we have a lot more answers to questions like that, because it's a basic question, right? It's very straightforward. It's something that, frankly, we really do need to get a handle on to identify, at what level, which factors, which aspects of society are driving these health inequities, because, it's ultimately a matter of life and death oftentimes. And so I do think it's really important that we get it right, and that we cast a wider net to get at other aspects of structural racism and also different levels and their interplay. So thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Taylor's question. Taylor, I've invited you to speak.
Can you hear me? Cool, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for a really fantastic presentation and all your really great work moving the field forward with this. Actually related to Hewat's question, I was wondering if you could speak to the different formulations of structural racism that you've used and the different ways you've sort of measured it as an exposure. So like in that structural intersectionality paper with Dr. Homan, using indices. Now it seems you and Dr. Shantaran and others are moving towards like a latent construct analysis and sort of the different like formulations of how to capture that and like the methodologies that go into that. And then also like their interpretations of, you kind of mentioned this in your presentation, but there's not really ever like a low level of structural racism, but it's all relative. But like in Dr. Shantaran's paper that you just mentioned, looking at kind of typologies of structural racism in different places and sort of how you think about those different like methodological approaches for conceptualizing it and their interpretation.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I'll lean on the fact that there's not a lot out there, but I think that, these are empirical questions that we've got to nail down. These are important questions, and you really know this literature quite well. You've really drilled down, you identify those differences. Yeah. So in the Homan, Brown, and King article that came out last year, we use an index. So it's a summative index at a high alpha value. And so it seemed to hang together quite well. And in this study, we're taking the next step and using a latent variable approach because we think it even better captures structural racism. I will tell you that they're extremely highly correlated, right? So north of 0.95 correlation. And so they tend to capture similar things, although that differs across years. And so I'm tinkering with more recent data, 2020 data, and I'm finding that, again, identify a single unidimensional latent construct for structural racism in the same domains, but that the correlation between the latent measure and the summative index isn't quite as high. It's still high, north of 0.7, but not quite as high, suggesting that they're capturing something somewhat distinct, interrelated but distinct. So, I think that there's room for both. I think that it's an open question. I think that the assumptions that are built into using a summative index are a little bit less tenable than the assumptions that you make when you're using a confirmatory factor analysis, where you're allowing, an equal weighting and you're allowing correlation between errors between the different indicators. So it has some unique aspects there where you're able to take those things into account that I think are useful and probably, more closely resemble reality. But ultimately, it comes down to the research question, I think, and the data. And so sometimes it might be that an index or an indicator fit great. And sometimes it might be, really necessary and useful to use a latent scale. You mentioned the work of others like the Chantrat articles that look at different typologies using latent class analyses of structural racism. And they tend to do that at a sub-state level, particularly, I believe Puma, at least for one of the studies. And yeah, so that's a whole different question, right? And so what that suggests is, at least at that level, for that sample, that there are these distinct typologies. And I think that's really fascinating that, we may not be capturing everything by one single unidimensional sort of measure. And so I think that's an important direction for us to move in, and looking at the relative merits. It may be that at some levels, there's a unidimensional or there's 2 dimensions or 5 dimensions. We really don't know. And so I think that, I'm excited to work in this space and see what we uncover. And I think obviously the next step then is to see, which of these dimensions matter most when we do in fact identify multiple sort of typologies.
Great. We'll move on to the next question with Surya.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. Definitely up my alley. So really appreciate you bringing this to light. I realize you have to be problem focused sometimes, but I also realize you have to be solution focused and action focused. So my question is, what specific current policies do you or your team plan to advocate for or against based off of your findings? And it might be further down the line, since this is like an infant project at this point, I guess. And do you plan to approach legislators with results and break down the implications for them? Because I think it's a little bit unclear for me, the step from doing your research, publishing it, and then actually putting it in action.
Yeah, well, I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? And I think that is, I don't know if it's the next step, but it's certainly a couple steps down the road. We're not there yet. We don't know. Well, at least I don't know. I think that, right there at UW, I think that probably Professor Grunbach would have a better answer than I would, given that he really focuses on particular policies and their impact on different groups and different subpopulations. And so, Yeah, I mean, from this particular study, it would be a leap for me to make any strong conclusions. I think what it does clearly demonstrate is that this is a system and these things are interrelated. And based on these results and also theory that looks at this systemically, I think about the work by folks like Eduardo Bonilla Silva or Barbara Reskin, who conceptualize discrimination and racism as a system. I think the big takeaway is that adjusting one aspect, one dimension, is unlikely to alter the system appreciably. And so the idea would be that you would need to make bold actions in multiple sectors in order to really have a major impact and really move the needle in a substantial way. So that would be my general sort of impression and assumption. But ultimately, I can't say what matters most. I know there's a recent article that between Kemp, Grumbach, and Montez that looked at policies across 15 different domains. And one of the strongest domains in terms of predicting health was civil rights policies. And so clearly those matter. And I think that another takeaway is that, social and economic political policies are in fact health policies. So I think that we know, and I don't think it's a leap to suggest that these may be even stronger determinants of health than actual health policy. But that, again, is an empirical question that I think that folks who are much smarter than me will be able to address, hopefully in the near future. And again, as I mentioned, there are some really great resources out there. There's this the article by Medina Agenor. I believe she has over 800 different policies in that database, and it's publicly available, so that's really useful. And also the data that's available by Golene Samari and also Morgan Philbin have data sets on immigration related policies. And I think that can be really useful for folks who are interested in studying structural xenophobia, which is obviously adjacent to structural racism.
Great, and we'll hear from Olivia now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Super interesting. And I'm curious whether any of your research considers the relationship between health equity and urban green space or urban green infrastructure, given that the distribution of this tends to be inequitable and is affected by policies of redlining, but also considering implications for things like climate resilience.
Yeah, so my study does not include any of that information. Right? Again, this is at the state level. I'm looking at domains of education, economics, politics, criminal legal, and also housing. But I take the point is well taken, thinking about the environment, thinking about the built environment, thinking about the actual environment and how that influences health, right? So I think that's an important context. Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how we could conceptualize that and measure that as a form of structural racism. I mean, obviously we know that these things are unequally distributed and that they're and in ways that are very predictable and racialized. And so I think that the challenge will be how do we measure that, right? In a way that we're able to capture the racialized aspects and then ultimately measure its impact on health, and then determine whether or not it leads to health inequities between groups or if it influences the health of groups differentially, right? Like my findings show that structural racism is largely predictive of the health of Blacks, but not whites. I wonder if we'll find the same thing when we look at some indicators or measures of the green environment and health.
Great. I actually have a question. So Dr. Hillman's work shows that structural sexism harms both men and women, so it's universally harmful to live in contexts where there's high sexism. Why don't we see the same thing for structural racism?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. They're different data, different time points. And Homan's work is really fascinating because she also looked at different levels, right? So she did macro, meso, and micro. And as I recall, at some levels, it was harmful for both men and women. And at some levels, men benefited from structural sexism. And so that may be a wrinkle, right? So who knows, when we take a multi-level approach, maybe we'll find something more interesting. Maybe we'll find that in some instances, or if we broaden this to looking at other health outcomes or other time periods or other levels, maybe we'll find that in fact, certain aspects of structural racism under certain conditions does in fact harm the health of white people. I'm agnostic when it comes to this. And so I'm testing those different competing hypotheses that I think kind of stem from ecosocial theory. The first being, conflict perspective, where one group benefits and the other group, gains, or the other group loses. And then the other is that this universal harm. And I think that's totally plausible for some outcomes under certain conditions. And so I think we need more research on this. And that's one reason why I actually advocate for looking at the impact of structural exposures on health within groups, so within racial groups versus on disparities between groups. I think both have their merits, but when we do separate it, and we do race stratified analyses, then we can see, really who it's potentially harming, and are there some groups that are benefiting, right? Because that's something that you can't quite get at when your outcome is on disparities between groups. And so I think that's one argument to be made for using sort of race stratified analyses.
Great, thank you so much for that. And so we have a question from Rena.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, my name is Reena Patel, and I am relatively new to the field of structural racism and social determinants of health. I am a HIV infectious diseases physician researcher and work, and we have an R1 coming forth in HIV, COVID, and social determinants of health. And so I've been listening to every word that's being discussed today. And I have a few questions, but as you've been talking, Tyson, I've been reflecting, because what we proposed, we're measuring various domains of social determinants of health. And it's some of the same language. And I would imagine some of the same measures like the Gini index and so forth. Where do we draw the boundaries between conceptual and measurement between structural racism and social determinants of health that create racialized inequities?
So the question is, where do we draw boundaries between social determinants and then a subcategory of the structural measures? Is that the question?
Right, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe, in our work, when we proposed this, we conceptualized that structural racism was, sometimes I hate using these terms, but it was a little more upstream from even social determinants of health, that a lot of that was forcing the way the racialized inequity then get enacted. So I apologize if this is a relatively naive question to the group, but it's something I'm struggling with as I'm coming new to this field.
Yeah, no, I think this is important to probe. So I just finished submitted an article on this topic to Milbank to some degree, in arguing that the field has really been focused at sort of midstream, right, downstream and midstream. So thinking about education, occupation, wealth, income, measured at the individual level, and maybe in arguing along with others that we need to look upstream, and in particular we need to look at what Bamberg refers to as the causes of the causes, right? So we look at the upstream causes of the midstream causes of downstream health consequences, right? And so I do think that that's important in terms of drawing the boundaries on what's what, where does structural end and where does other social determinants begin. I can't say. That's a good question. This might be a good question to open up to the audience, but I think that one key distinction is the most obviously going beyond indicators measured at the individual level, right? And so for me, that's been going beyond education, income, occupation, stress, exposure, to saying what are the conditions that lead to those conditions. And we know that things like segregation, criminal legal contact, and educational composition or educational domain, and also housing, economics, and politics. We know that these sort of contexts do in fact shape those midstream factors, which ultimately shape health. And so I think an important next direction will be not only causal modeling using longitudinal data, but also sort of more rigorous causal mediation analysis, right? And so actually measuring exactly that process of how upstream factors influence downstream health outcomes, and explicitly modeling those social pathways to test formal tests of mediation. And then, parallel is thinking about the biological mechanisms, right? So how does that upstream structural disadvantage become embodied? How does it get under the skin to ultimately lead to these health inequities? We really know very little about that. And so I think that's an important direction for future research as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Tyson. This presentation was excellent. I really enjoyed the discussion. So Tyson has generously agreed to meet with the graduate students after for the post-seminar discussion. Grace will drop that link in the chat. Dr. Brown, do you have the link as well?
I do.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful. I love the questions. This is really helpful.
Great.